I never imagined the woman who taught me what safety wasn't would one day stand at a podium in front of every camera in the county and tell a room full of strangers that I made it all up. My name is Naomi Calder. I investigate child abuse cases for a living, and this is the story of the year my own childhood got turned into a political talking point, 3 feet from a microphone, in front of everyone whose respect I'd spent a career earning. I've worked child welfare investigations for 9 years. Mostly the cases nobody wants. The ones where a kid says something small and half-formed to a teacher, and it's my job to figure out, carefully, and without leading them anywhere, whether that small thing is the whole iceberg or just the tip everyone's afraid to name. I'm good at it. In the specific, unglamorous way you get good at something you needed someone to be good at for you once, and nobody was. Not at first. I write everything down. Every interview, every observation, every date, in the same careful, factual language, because I learned a long time ago, long before I ever had a badge or a case file of my own to manage, that a child's word alone rarely survives contact with an adult who's decided not to believe it. A document survives. A memory, alone, does not. I was placed with Miriam Sorrell's foster home when I was 8 years old, after my mother's addiction finally cost her custody for good, and I stayed there until I was 11, when a school counselor named Adrian Halloran noticed something in me he wasn't willing to look away from. I'm not going to walk you through those 3 years scene by scene, because that's not actually what this story is about, and because some things don't need to be relived in detail to be understood. What I'll tell you is this. Miriam Sorrell ran that house on rules that shifted depending on her mood, punishments that outlasted whatever I'd supposedly done to earn them, and a very specific talent for making sure nothing she did ever looked, from the outside, like anything worth a second glance. Foster homes get visited. Inspectors come through. She was polished for every single one of them, and I was quiet for every single one of them, because by the time I was 9 years old, I had already learned the central lesson of that house. Telling the truth changed nothing except how much worse things got afterward. Mr. Halloran was the exception. He noticed things, a flinch, a long sleeve in August, the particular quiet of a kid who's learned that saying less is safer than saying anything at all. And instead of deciding it wasn't his business, he asked me one direct question in his office one Tuesday afternoon that I still remember word for word almost 30 years later. "Naomi, are you safe at home?" I didn't answer him with words at first. I just started crying, the kind of crying that comes out sideways because you've been holding it so long you've forgotten it's allowed to leave. He didn't rush me. He waited. And when I finally told him, carefully, in pieces, the way children tell you things when they're testing whether the floor is actually going to hold, he said something I would carry with me for the rest of my life, without fully understanding at 11 how literally I'd eventually need it. "I believe you," he said. "And here's what we're going to do about that. We're going to write it down." He filed a mandatory report that same afternoon. A caseworker interviewed me twice over the following 2 weeks. A doctor documented what needed documenting, and within a month I was removed from Miriam Sorrell's home and placed somewhere else entirely, a harder placement in some ways, a kinder one in the ways that mattered most. That file, the counselor's report, the interview transcripts, the medical documentation, the intake records, became a sealed juvenile record the moment the case closed, the way these things are handled by law to protect the privacy of a minor. I didn't think about that file again for almost 20 years. I had no idea, filling out my own academy application at 22, citing personal experience with the child welfare system in the vaguest possible language, how much that quiet, sealed piece of paperwork was going to matter one October evening decades later. Miriam Sorrell did not disappear from my life the way I once assumed she would. She became, over the following 2 decades, exactly the kind of public figure nobody who actually knew her past would ever expect. A city council member, then a state assembly candidate, the founder of a well-regarded nonprofit called the Sorrell Family Fund that provided holiday gifts and school supplies to children in the foster system every December, photographed every year with a gymnasium full of donated backpacks and her own careful, camera-ready smile. She spoke at conferences about giving every child a voice. She was, by every public measure, exactly the kind of advocate my own profession is supposed to celebrate. I want to be honest about something that isn't flattering. For years, I told myself her public reinvention had nothing to do with me, that the world was simply large enough for both of us to exist in it, without our paths ever needing to cross. I avoided events where she might be present. I never once, in 9 years on this job, requested a case connected to any organization she was involved with. There was one exception, years earlier, that I didn't understand the full weight of until much later. At a mutual acquaintance's fundraiser when I was 26, I found myself unexpectedly in the same banquet hall as Sorrel for the first time since I'd left her home. She approached me herself, smiling, and introduced me to the small group she was standing with as a young woman who spent some time in my care, years ago, when she was going through a very difficult period. Nothing in that sentence was technically false. Everything about it was designed to make the difficulty sound like it had lived inside me rather than inside her house. I remember standing there, 26 years old, feeling the same specific wordless flinch I used to feel at 8, and saying nothing, because I told myself it was such a small thing, hardly worth a scene at someone else's party. I understand now that it wasn't small at all. It was a rehearsal. A quieter, private version of the exact sentence she'd eventually deliver into a dozen microphones 12 years later, tested first on a room of strangers who had no reason to ever ask me for the other half of the story. It worked, mostly, until the year the state's Department of Family Services restructured its regional oversight board, and Miriam Sorrell was appointed by the governor's office to chair it, the exact board that would eventually oversee funding decisions for the very unit I work in. I remember the specific, cold stillness of reading that announcement on my phone at my kitchen table and thinking, for the first time in almost 20 years, that the distance I'd built between us had just been quietly erased by someone else's decision, not mine. The first small crack in her polished public version of things came from somewhere I never expected. A young journalist named Adam Salinger, working on a profile piece about the region's most influential child advocates ahead of Sorrell's expected state Senate run. He'd requested comment from several people in the local welfare system, myself included, and asked, almost as an afterthought at the end of our brief phone call, whether I'd ever crossed paths with Councilwoman Sorrell professionally. I told him carefully that our paths had overlapped at the administrative level, which was true and revealed nothing. He thanked me and moved on. I hung up the phone with my hands not quite steady, and I understood for the first time that somewhere in the process of researching her glowing public record, someone was eventually going to stumble onto the plain, boring fact that I had once lived in her home as a foster child. I called my supervisor, Director Farah Lund, that same week. Not to raise an alarm exactly, just to be transparent about a connection that existed. The way I'm trained to disclose any conflict before it becomes a surprise to someone else. Farah listened carefully, the way she always does, and told me she appreciated me bringing it to her directly, and that as far as she was concerned, it was ancient history with no bearing on my current casework. I believed her. I had no way yet of knowing that ancient history was about to become the exact phrase Sorrell would use to bury me in front of a room full of cameras. 2 weeks later, a colleague of mine, Denise Ahn, mentioned over coffee, lightly, that she'd heard some interesting things about my background from a friend who worked in the State Assembly's press office. I asked her directly what she meant. She waved it off, said it was probably nothing, said she was sure I'd tell her if there was anything to actually know. I told her there wasn't. That was true, and it also wasn't the whole truth, and I felt, hanging up that call, the specific discomfort of being asked a direct question by someone who already half suspected the shape of an answer I wasn't ready to give her yet. The event itself was billed, in every press release leading up to it, as a celebration. The ribbon cutting for a new regional family services resource center, funded in significant part by the Sorrell Family Fund, attended by half the county's elected officials, a dozen reporters, community members, and, because my own department had a formal partnership with the new center, most of my direct coworkers, myself included. I want to be honest that I considered skipping it. Farah asked me directly whether I'd be more comfortable sending someone else in my place, and some tired, cautious part of me almost said yes. I said no instead, because after 2 decades of quietly rearranging my own life around avoiding one woman, some part of me had finally decided I was done doing that. And because I told myself, wrongly, that a ribbon cutting was too small and too public a stage for anything to actually happen. I want to walk through exactly what happened over the next several minutes, because I've replayed them more times than any other minutes of my adult life, and because the shape of what she did only makes sense once you see it laid end to end. The ceremony opened the way these things always do. A few short remarks from the mayor, a plaque unveiling, polite applause. Then a local reporter, near the back of the small crowd, asked Councilwoman Sorrell a question that had clearly been prepared in advance, referencing the fund's decades of work, supporting children in the foster system, including some who've gone on to careers in child welfare themselves. It was, I understood instantly, Adam Salinger's earlier research finally surfacing in someone else's question, and I felt my whole body go very still, standing near the back of that crowd in my department's navy blazer, watching the exact collision I'd spent 20 years avoiding arrive anyway, in front of every camera in the county. Sorrell's smile did not change at all. That's the detail I think about most, even now. She turned toward the crowd, found me with her eyes in about 2 seconds. She'd clearly known I was there the entire time, and said, in the same warm, practiced voice she used for every camera she'd ever stood in front of, "Actually, since it's come up, I think it's important to be transparent. Naomi Calder, who I see is here today representing the department, was placed in my home many years ago as a young girl. It was, I'll be honest, a difficult placement. Naomi struggled with some very serious behavioral issues at the time, including making some allegations against our household that, after full investigation, were understood to be the product of a troubled child looking for attention rather than anything that had actually happened. I've never spoken about it publicly out of respect for her privacy. But since her presence today seems to be raising questions, I think the public deserves the full picture rather than half of one." I felt every single person in that crowd turn to look at me at once. I've learned since that the loneliest rooms aren't the empty ones. They're the full ones. The ones packed with people who know your name, watching you, and not one of them quite ready yet to move. I want to describe that specific silence honestly, because I think it's the part people rush past when they hear a story like mine and skip straight to the ending. It is a very particular kind of alone. To be standing in a crowd of your own colleagues, in the uniform of your own profession, and to feel, in the space of about 4 seconds, an entire room quietly deciding whether the last 20 years of you were real. A reporter near the front, someone I didn't recognize, raised his hand almost immediately and asked, loudly enough for the whole crowd to hear, "Ms. Calder, can you respond to that? Is it true you fabricated abuse allegations as a child?" I remember the specific cruelty of that question, not because it was hostile exactly, but because it was so casually curious, the way you'd ask someone to confirm a mildly interesting fact rather than defend the single worst thing anyone had ever said about them in public. I looked past him, for just a second, at the small crowd behind the reporters, community members who'd come for a ribbon cutting and gotten something else entirely. A few of them already leaning toward each other, whispering. I saw a woman I recognized from the new Resource Center's advisory board quietly step back from the front row, putting a few extra feet of distance between herself and wherever this was heading, her face carefully arranged into something between concern and caution. I saw one of my own coworkers, a caseworker I'd trained personally, look down at his own shoes rather than at me. Nobody said anything cruel out loud in that moment. Nobody needed to. A crowd deciding, in real time, how much distance to put between themselves and you is its own kind of verdict, delivered without a single word. I did not answer that question the way I wanted to. 9 years of interviewing frightened, cornered people for a living had taught me exactly one thing that mattered in that moment. The person who reacts first, loudest, and least carefully in front of cameras is the person the footage will remember worst. "I'm not going to discuss my personal history at a ribbon cutting," I said, and I kept my voice level, though I don't fully know how. I have every confidence in the documented record of that time, whenever it's appropriate to discuss it. It was, I understand now, the correct thing to say. It did almost nothing to stop what happened next. I watched over the following days, small shifts in people around me that told me more than any headline did. Denise Ahn, the coworker who'd mentioned hearing things weeks earlier, started finding reasons not to be in the break room at the same time as me. A caseworker I'd trained personally 2 years earlier stopped CCing me on updates for a joint case we'd been running, without explanation, until I asked directly and got a vague answer about streamlining communication. Farah called me into her office the following Monday, kind but visibly careful, to tell me that given the public nature of the allegations, the department had decided, as a precaution, to place me on administrative desk duty, while an internal review looked into whether anything about my personal history created a conflict of interest or credibility concern for active casework. She said it gently. She still said it. I sat in that office understanding, with total clarity, that the woman who'd once controlled every rule in her own house 20 years ago had just, without lifting a finger beyond a single sentence at a podium, managed to take my actual job away from me too. If you've ever had someone rewrite the truest, hardest thing that ever happened to you into a story more convenient for them, and watched people believe the convenient version because it was delivered with a smile instead of a shout, stay with me, because the next stretch of this story is where I stopped waiting to be believed and started making sure I couldn't be doubted. The weeks after the ribbon cutting were slower and lonelier than the event itself, which I hadn't expected. The same way I don't think anyone expects the quiet aftermath of something loud to hurt nearly as much as it does. A defense attorney on an unrelated case I'd worked 8 months earlier filed a motion citing recent public questions about the investigator's credibility, attempting to reopen a closed matter entirely because of a sentence Sorrell had said at a ribbon cutting that had nothing to do with my professional record at all. It didn't succeed. It still cost me 2 additional weeks of depositions I wouldn't have otherwise needed to sit through, defending work I'd done years ago, competently, because someone's public smear had given a defense attorney a convenient new angle to try. A second attorney, on an entirely different case, tried something similar a month later, and though that motion was dismissed even faster than the first, I noticed my own supervisor start reviewing my case notes with a slightly closer eye than she had before any of this, checking dates and phrasing I'd written years earlier, as though she half expected to find something in them that wasn't actually there. I didn't blame her for it, exactly. I understood, watching her double-check work she'd trusted unquestioningly for years, that a single public accusation doesn't just cost you the room it happens in. It costs you a small, quiet percentage of every room you walk into afterward, for longer than anyone tells you it will. Surviving something, I've come to understand, is only ever half of the job. The other half is spending years afterward convincing people the thing you survived was real in the first place. A young woman I'd been mentoring informally for almost 2 years, a girl named Kayla, who'd aged out of the foster system the previous spring and still called me most weeks just to check in, texted me 3 days after the ribbon cutting, hesitant in a way she'd never been with me before. Is it true, what that lady said? I don't know what to believe right now. I sat with that message a long time before answering, because I understood, reading it, that the damage had reached even the one relationship I'd built specifically to be the opposite of what had happened to me. A young person who'd finally learned to trust an adult, now quietly wondering whether that trust had been built on something false. I told her the truth, plainly. That I couldn't discuss my own sealed juvenile record casually, but that everything that had happened to me had been documented by professionals at the time, and that I would never, ever ask her to simply take my word for something as serious as this, without also giving her a way to know it was true. She said she understood. I don't think she fully did yet. I didn't blame her for that. People don't always choose the version of you that's true. Sometimes they choose whichever version costs them the least to carry. And at 19, still learning which adults in her life were safe to believe completely, Kayla was simply doing the math she'd been taught, the hard way, to do first and ask questions after. My own mother, not my birth mother, who I'd lost touch with years before any of this, but Farah, who had become something close to family over 9 years of working together, asked me once, gently, over a coffee she'd insisted on buying, whether there was any chance at all that things had been more complicated than I remembered as a child, that memory does strange things under stress. I understood she meant it kindly, as an attempt to give me an exit that let both of us be comfortable. Kindness, I've noticed since, is sometimes just doubt wearing a gentler voice, and it can be much harder to argue with than the loud kind, because you end up feeling guilty for even noticing it was doubt at all. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that I had spent 9 years of my career, specifically not asking traumatized children whether their memory might simply be complicated, because that question is exactly the one that teaches a child to stop trusting themselves before anyone else even has the chance to. She apologized. I believed she meant it. It still cost something between us that took a long time to fully repair. I did not call Miriam Sorrell and demand an apology. I had no leverage yet beyond my own memory, and I've spent 9 years watching memory alone lose to a confident, well-dressed adult in nearly every room that matters. What I did instead was the only thing that had ever actually worked for the child I used to be. I went looking for the paperwork. I called a family law attorney named Colette Anders, someone I'd worked alongside professionally on custody matters for years and trusted completely, and told her everything: the placement, Mr. Halloran, the sealed file, the ribbon cutting, all of it, in order, the way I'd walk a colleague through any case file. The first thing you need to understand, she told me in our first meeting, is that sealed juvenile records exist specifically to protect children, which means unsealing your own file, even at your own request, isn't automatic. But defamation of this kind, a public, specific, false statement about you, made to a room full of press, causing demonstrable professional harm, gives us real legal standing to petition the court for a limited unsealing, specifically to establish the documented facts of what actually happened to you as a child. She paused. I need you to understand this will take time. Courts don't move at the speed of a press conference, but a documented record, once it's opened properly, doesn't get to be argued with the way a memory does. We filed the petition within the month, citing the public statement, its professional consequences, and the specific, narrow legal basis for unsealing a juvenile record when its subject requests it for their own defense. The state's response took 6 weeks, longer than either of us wanted, filled with the specific, grinding discouragement of having done everything correctly, and still not yet holding the one thing that would actually matter. The first update we received wasn't the file itself, only confirmation that the original county records office where the case had been processed had migrated to a new digital system 11 years earlier, and that locating the original physical file required a manual archive search rather than a simple database pull. I remember sitting in Colette's office that week, feeling something I recognized instantly from 9 years of watching frightened families wait on systems that move slower than their pain does. The specific ache of trusting a process you can't personally speed up. It was, unexpectedly, Mr. Halloran himself who gave us the piece that moved things forward. Colette had tracked him down through the school district's retiree records. 71 now, retired 11 years, still living 2 towns over. He remembered me instantly when she called, remembered the report, remembered the exact date, because he told her he'd kept his own private notes from every mandatory report he'd ever filed across a 30-year career, a habit born from watching too many official files get lost, misplaced, or quietly buried over the decades. I learned a long time ago, he told Colette, that the county's paperwork isn't always as permanent as everyone assumes. So I started keeping my own. His personal notes, dated the same week as his original report, matched every detail I remembered, independently, before either of us had seen the official county file at all. The full county archive search took another 5 weeks, and what it eventually produced didn't just confirm what I already knew. It went further than I expected. Buried in the same regional archive, filed 2 years before my own case, was a second sealed juvenile record connected to the same address. A different child, removed from Miriam Sorrell's home under nearly identical circumstances, following a separate mandatory report from a different school entirely. I want to be careful here, because that file wasn't mine to open or to describe in detail. and I never once tried to. What Colette confirmed, through the proper legal channel, was simply that it existed, that it corroborated a documented pattern rather than a single isolated incident, and that the state's own records, kept independently by two different institutions 20 years apart, agreed with each other in a way no single person's memory ever could. I sat with that discovery for a long time before I felt anything close to relief, because underneath the vindication was something sadder than I expected. The specific, quiet confirmation that whatever had happened to me hadn't been an aberration. It had been a pattern. And somewhere, another child who'd once sat in an office like Mr. Halloran's, telling a version of the same truth I once told, had never had a career or a press conference, or an attorney to eventually make anyone listen twice. I want to be honest about a temptation I had that week, because I think it says something true about how easy it is to let a righteous cause excuse an unrighteous shortcut. I have access, through my own job, to systems that could have told me far more about that second case than the archive search legally allowed me to know. For about a day, I genuinely considered using it, telling myself it was in service of a larger truth, that the ends would justify one small, quiet misuse of my own professional access. I didn't do it. I called Colette instead and told her exactly what I was tempted to do and why I wasn't going to. "Good," she said simply. "Because the moment you use your position to dig somewhere you're not supposed to, you become exactly the kind of person who decided the rules didn't apply to them when the cause felt big enough. That's the entire thing we're fighting against right now. Don't become a smaller version of it to win." The hearing was held in a modest state administrative courtroom, convened jointly to address both my petition to unseal the limited relevant portions of my juvenile record and a formal ethics complaint Colette had filed separately regarding Sorrell's public statement, given her current position on a state oversight board specifically responsible for child welfare funding. Sorrell arrived composed, in a soft blue blazer, flanked by an attorney and, I noticed, considerably fewer cameras than the ribbon cutting had carried. This room had rules about recording that a public sidewalk never did, and something in her posture told me she understood, walking in, exactly how much that difference mattered. Her attorney opened plainly. "This hearing concerns a private citizen's characterization of a difficult childhood placement more than 2 decades ago. Councilwoman Sorrell's comments, while perhaps imprecisely worded, reflected her honest recollection of events. Memory is imperfect for everyone involved, including Ms. Calder." He called a witness first, a longtime board member of the Sorrell Family Fund named Walter Gentz, who testified warmly and at length about Sorrell's decades of visible generosity, the backpack drives, the holiday gift program, the countless hours she'd given to children in the system. It was, for a few minutes, genuinely moving testimony, and I watched Judge Cade listen to it with real attention. Colette's cross-examination was brief. "Mr. Gentz, in your years on the Funds Board, did you ever personally observe Councilwoman Sorrell's day-to-day parenting of any child placed in her home?" He admitted he had not, that his relationship with her had always been through the Fund's public work, never inside her household. "So your testimony speaks to her public generosity," Colette said, "not to what happened behind her own front door." He agreed, a little less certainly than he'd started. Colette's response was narrow and unhurried. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence the original 1998 mandatory reporter's filing, the accompanying medical documentation from the treating physician at the time, the caseworker's contemporaneous intake notes, and a corroborating personal record independently maintained by the reporting counselor for the past 26 years. She paused. "This isn't a dispute between two people's memories. This is a documented, sealed government record, created the same week the events occurred, by 3 separate professionals with no relationship to each other, being weighed against a single unscripted sentence delivered at a press event 26 years later." Mr. Halloran testified first, calm and precise even at 71, walking the hearing officer, a measured woman named Judge Rosalind Cade, through the exact sequence of that Tuesday afternoon in 1998. The flinch he'd noticed, the direct question he'd asked, my answer, the report he'd filed that same day. He read a portion of his own private notes aloud. dated and initialed, and I watched Judge Cade's expression stay carefully neutral throughout. The specific neutrality of someone who has learned not to react to evidence until she's seen all of it. Sorrel's attorney tried, briefly, to suggest that a counselor's decades-old recollection was itself just another form of memory, no more reliable than his client's. Judge Cade addressed that directly, before Colette even needed to. "Counsel, Mr. Halloran isn't offering a recollection. He's offering a contemporaneous written report, filed under mandatory reporting law the same day the events occurred, corroborated by his own independent notes and by medical and intake documentation, created by separate professionals that same month. That is meaningfully different from a public statement made 26 years after the fact, with no supporting record at all." Sorrel took the stand near the end of the hearing, and for the first several minutes, she held to the same composed, faintly wounded register she'd used at the podium. A woman who'd given decades of her life to children, being unfairly relitigated over a difficult placement from long ago. It was Colette's next question that finally cracked something in her that I don't think she'd examined honestly in 26 years. "Councilwoman, are you aware that a second child was removed from your home under similar circumstances 2 years before Ms. Calder's placement?" Sorrel was quiet for long enough that the silence itself became its own kind of testimony. When she finally answered, her voice had lost the practiced warmth entirely, replaced by something quieter and, I'll admit, harder to simply hate than I expected it to be. "I raised 11 foster children over the course of my life," she said. "I gave up evenings, money, a version of my own life I might have had otherwise, to take in children nobody else wanted. I built an entire second career trying to give back what I believed, in my own way, I had given those children. I am not." She stopped, started again, quieter. "I discipline children strictly. I believed for a very long time that strictness was its own form of care, the kind I never received myself as a child. I have spent 26 years telling myself that the 2 removals from my home were about overzealous reporting, not about anything I actually did. I said what I said at that podium because I have said it to myself in the mirror for so long that I had genuinely started to believe it was true. I understand now, sitting here, that believing something for a long time is not the same as it being real." Her voice caught, once, and she didn't try to hide it. "I don't know how to undo 26 years of telling myself a kinder version of who I was. I only know I can't keep asking Naomi to carry the cost of that kindness instead of me." I understood, sitting there, something that surprised me, that her fear of her own history was probably real, and that being real didn't excuse a single thing she'd said about me in front of a room full of cameras to protect it. "You didn't just cost me a childhood 26 years ago," I said when it was my turn to speak. "You cost me my job, my coworkers' trust, and a young woman I mentor, wondering if I'd lied to her, all over again, at 40 years old, because it was easier for you to call me troubled than to sit with what you actually did. My file didn't lie about any of it. You did, for 26 years to everyone, including yourself." Judge Cade's ruling was measured and precise. She granted the limited unsealing of the specific documented portions of my juvenile record relevant to the public dispute, entering them into the official record of the ethics proceeding. She found, separately, that Sorrel's public statement constituted a knowing or reckless falsehood regarding a matter of documented fact, sufficient to sustain both the defamation claim and a formal referral to the State Ethics Board regarding her fitness to continue chairing an oversight board responsible for child welfare funding decisions. What neither of us fully understood yet, sitting in that courtroom, was how far the consequences would travel. Sorrel resigned from the oversight board within 2 weeks, before the ethics board's own review could conclude, and withdrew from the state senate race entirely a month later, citing in a brief statement a desire to focus on family. The Sorrel Family Funds Board, independent of her, voted to remove her name from the organization by winter, a decision I felt no particular satisfaction in, only a quiet, complicated relief that whatever happened to the children still connected to that fund going forward. At least her name wouldn't be the one attached to deciding it. I want to tell you what happened after, because I think it matters as much as the ruling itself. My department's internal review closed within a week of the hearing, clearing me fully, and, at Farah's insistence, issuing an internal correction to every case file that had cited credibility concerns in the interim. Farah herself apologized to me personally, plainly, without excuses. "I should have trusted the years I already had with you over one sentence from someone I barely know," she told me. "I let a stranger's confidence outweigh 9 years of your work, and I am sorry it took a courtroom to remind me which one actually deserved the benefit of the doubt." I told her I appreciated her saying it. I also told her honestly that it would take me a while before that particular kind of doubt from her stopped sitting somewhere in my chest when we spoke. She said that was fair, and she's earned quite a bit of that trust back since, slowly, the way most real trust gets rebuilt. Denise Ahn never fully apologized, not directly, though she's stopped avoiding the break room, and some mornings that's the version of repair I've decided I have room to accept. Some relationships, I've learned, don't come back all the way. They come back to somewhere workable instead, and I've stopped needing every one of them to be more than that. A woman named Priya Okonkwo Bafur, who I hadn't spoken to in almost 20 years, the child from that second sealed file, though I only understood the connection once she reached out herself, having recognized the outline of her own story in a brief news mention of the ethics hearing, sent me a message the week the ruling became public. I think we might have lived in the same house once, a couple years apart. I never told anyone what happened there either. Thank you for making it impossible to keep pretending it didn't happen to either of us. We've spoken a handful of times since. Neither of us has needed to compare our stories in detail. Knowing the other one exists, and was telling the truth the whole time too, has been enough. Kayla called me the week the ruling became public, crying before she'd even said hello properly. "I'm so sorry I asked if it was true," she said. "I should have known better. You never gave me a reason to doubt you." And I told her that I understood exactly why she'd needed to ask, that a 19-year-old who'd learned the hard way not to trust adults blindly wasn't wrong to want proof instead of just my word, and that I'd rather she ask me a hard question honestly than pretend she wasn't wondering at all. She still calls most weeks. I think, if anything, she trusts me more now. Not because I was vindicated, but because I never once asked her to simply take my side, without evidence, even when it would have been easier for both of us. I never spoke to Miriam Sorrell again after that hearing. I heard, through channels I have no particular interest in verifying closely, that she moved out of the county within the year. I don't know if she's found any real peace with the parts of herself she admitted to on that stand, or if that admission was simply the version of honesty a courtroom finally forced out of her. I've decided I don't need to know which, for my own peace to hold steady regardless. Mr. Halloran and I still talk twice a year, usually around the anniversary of that Tuesday afternoon in his office, though neither of us ever needs to say out loud which date we're marking. He told me, the last time we spoke, that he still keeps private notes on every report he files, even now, retired, occasionally called in as a consultant for the district. "Some people spend their whole lives hoping nobody checks the paperwork," he said. "I've spent mine making sure somebody always could." I think about that a lot now, more than almost anything else this whole ordeal taught me. Some people spend their whole lives protecting the version of themselves they can live with, even when it means someone else has to carry the true version instead. I don't think that makes them monsters, exactly. I think it makes them human, in the specific, unflattering way most of us are when the truth would cost us something we've built our whole identity on protecting. The difference I've learned between surviving that and being buried by it isn't how loudly you insist on the truth. It's whether, somewhere quietly, years before you ever needed it, someone was careful enough to write it down. The Resource Center still stands, oddly enough, under a new, simpler name, now that the board removed hers from it. I drove past it a few weeks ago on my way to a home visit and saw a group of kids from a nearby group home being walked through the front doors for an after-school program, laughing about something I couldn't hear from the road. I sat at the light a moment longer than I needed to, watching them go in, and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite peace, but was close enough to it that I let myself sit with it the whole rest of the drive. If someone has ever rewritten the truest, hardest thing that ever happened to you into a story that was easier for them to live with, I don't think you're wrong to still feel the weight of it, even after you've been proven right. Being believed doesn't erase the years you spent needing to be. It just finally lets you put them down.